Right, so paleo diets are a common term that's thrown around the social media realm a lot these days, especially in food marketing as well. And despite the certainty that people pretend to have about defining it, it's actually not that clear at all. So the theory is that we should eat like our Paleolithic ancestors because they didn't have the chronic diseases we have today. This is most commonly interpreted as don't eat carbohydrates like any kind of fruit, and instead eating lots of protein like meat, nuts, and some non-starchy vegetables like leafy greens. And of course the things you shouldn't have are other kind of carbohydrates, sugar, refined breads, etc. Now this sounds like a reasonable theory, and it has strengths to it that I do agree with and are common sense. Eat more vegetables, eat nuts, eat other forms of real and whole food, and massively reduce or cut out processed foods like sugar, bread, etc. But there are also some major aspects that one should question about it, especially in the way modern food companies have marketed it and internet zealots have portrayed it. So the first major issue which we should be aware of is that modern big food companies are selling products labeled paleo that are low carbohydrate and high in protein, right? But the truth is these products, they are so far away from true paleo, and often, but not always, they're very unhealthy. So please be aware, these products like paleo bars and paleo powders, they're often high in refined and processed animal or plant protein, low in fiber, and high in processed vegetable oils. So this is not how Paleolithic people ate. So please avoid them until you really understand how to analyze food products. Now, the second major issue with this popularized concept of paleo is that there is no such thing as a single paleo way of eating. Different cultures had very different styles of eating depending on the climate and the region that they lived in. Some cultures ate large amounts of carbohydrates in the forms of honey, fruit, roots, yams, tubers, especially in tropical and subtropical parts of the world. And in fact, Indigenous Australians, we know now they ate lots of grains and yams and things like that. So it's impossible to define the one paleo diet because there is not just one. The lesson we can take away is that the common ground amongst all Paleolithic people is that they all were eating whole foods and no processed food, and that all known Paleolithic peoples ate some form of whole food carbohydrates like fruits, yams, potatoes, and honey. Even the Inuits, who are the indigenous people of Canada, where fresh plant food is very scarce during winter, were known to have traded food with the people from the south who ate some forms of plant carbohydrate. So paleo cultures also often had very, very high intakes of fiber, though not always, but often did, from the food they were eating. The traditional Hadza people of Africa living today are having over 100 grams of fiber versus in, let's say, the average American or Australian is having about 15 grams. In Paleolithic times, the food was scarce, which is the complete opposite of today's world where food, or at least processed food, is everywhere. So it's normal to go for periods without eating, which is called fasting. If you've ever tried to go out hunting or live off the land for a few days where there's no food prepared, there's absolutely no way you're going to be eating 3 meals a day. If you get one a day, you're lucky, and that's how it would have been in Paleolithic times. It would have been feast or famine. So taking all of that into account, what is the evidence that eating a type of Paleolithic diet will actually help with weight loss? We've actually known for quite a while that it will. In 1984, Professor Karen O'Day of Australia followed 10 Aboriginal men who went from living in an urban lifestyle to their traditional way of life for 7 weeks. Over that 7 weeks, they lost an average of 8 kilos, or almost 20 pounds, and they had improvements as well in their blood sugars, which is really impressive. Short amount of time going back to that way of life. But there are, of course, 3 fairly significant caveats to make to this though, which is commonly misinterpreted, which is why I'm covering it. Despite 2/3 of their calories being due to animal sources and 1/3 of their calories being due to plant sources, their diet was still very low in fat. Only 13% of their calories came from fat because wild animals have a very low fat content, and that's actually much lower than most of the low fat diet trials that are around, which is about 30%. So this is a common misconception about paleo diets. They're high in fat and protein. No, they weren't actually, or at least in this situation, they weren't. Today we eat a lot of cows, pigs, chicken, and sheep that are often fed on a mix of grass and grain. Hence the composition of the animal proteins and fats between wild and other livestock can be really different, and the effects of those proteins and fats on us can be very different as well. So this brings me to my next caveat, which is we have to be very careful about high animal protein diets, especially if you have heart disease. Right? There have been many studies showing that high animal protein diets can rapidly worsen heart disease, which I'll put 3 links to below. And one huge study of 450,000 people reviewed 25 years of evidence showed that low-carb dietary intake patterns, which had a high focus on animal-derived protein and fat, like I said, lamb, beef, pork and chicken, were associated with higher all-cause death, whereas those who favored plant-based protein and fat, like vegetables, nuts, seeds, etc., had a lower cause. So please be careful not to mortgage your long-term health for short-term weight loss. Now, the next caveat is that paleo is not just about what food we eat. I think that should be pretty obvious now. When we look at Paleolithic cultures, we see, yes, a lower burden of chronic diseases and obesity, but that's because they're an entire way of life. They eat whole foods and real foods, which is great, totally agree with that. They move regularly, they hunt, they forage, they live in tribes and they support each other. They sleep when the sun goes down and they get up when the sun comes up. It's actually a whole lifestyle that they're incorporating, which is really, really healthy. When we look at the modernized interpretation of high protein diets like the Atkins diet, we once again see that after 12 months, they're about as effective as each other in the modern world. So what we need to do is look at your entire lifestyle, how well you can continue this, and its long-term effects on your health, not just your weight. So, if we summarize all of that information, here's my interpretation of the paleo diet. The first is it's a lifestyle, not a diet. It's a paleo lifestyle, focused on whole and real foods, periods of fasting, moving regularly, and supported by those around you. I 100% agree with that Paleolithic lifestyle. Specific components mean having wild game meat, roots, yams, sweet potatoes, nuts, seeds, honey, eggs, and fruit, and of course, lots of vegetables and protein from plant sources. Now, if you do this, you're likely to get pretty good outcomes. I would say for the best long-term health outcomes, you probably want to reduce your animal intake and replace it with plant forms of protein like nuts and seeds and so on. And of course, stay away from those modern marketing paleo bars.